From Terror to Hope. One girl's incredible story of survival and healing in the wake of September 11th. The morning of September 11th, 2001 dawned cool and bright in New York City, a welcome relief after the steamy summer rain the day before. Like most of the 8 million people who lived in the city, 12-year-old Helena Hovitz was getting ready for the day. An only child, Helena lived in a tall apartment building at the southern end of Manhattan. She brushed her hair one last time and dashed out the door. Outside, Helena and her friend Nadine wove their way through the hustle and bustle of downtown Manhattan to their middle school. Around them, the city vibrated with life. Men and women in perfectly pressed suits emerged from the subways, clutching their coffee cups and newspapers. Police officers directed traffic. The sound of construction and honking taxis formed a familiar cacophony. To many New Yorkers, the city felt like the center of the world, a place of opportunity, business, culture, and diversity. Step into any subway car and you could find yourself sandwiched between a millionaire banker, a tattooed teenager speaking French, and a photojournalist from South Africa. Perhaps nothing symbolized the power and possibilities of New York City more than the pair of buildings that rose up from the World Trade Center at the southern tip of Manhattan, the Twin Towers. At 110 stories, the two silver skyscrapers were the tallest in New York and could be seen for miles around. Helena passed under their shadows each day on her way to school. But as she walked to school on the morning of September 11th, what Helena could not have imagined was that the city she loved was about to be attacked. Take me with you. The floor shook. The shelves rattled. It was 8:46 a.m., and Helena was sitting in first period science. The students looked at each other in surprise. What was that strange noise? Helena darted to the window, trying to see what was going on. She guessed a passing truck had popped a tire. But in fact, terrorists had deliberately crashed an airplane into one of the Twin Towers, the North Tower, a few blocks from Helena's school. Then the sirens began. Helena's teacher stepped out for a moment. When he returned, he told the class to gather their things and head to the cafeteria. Rumors flew. The bomb squad appeared. Meanwhile, a second plane crashed into the South Tower. The principal announced that the school was to be evacuated in 5 minutes. Almost immediately, parents began pouring into the building, hastily grabbing their children. Students whose parents couldn't get to them were to be taken to a safe zone. Helena's mom worked far uptown, and her dad was across New York Harbor in Staten Island. Helena knew there was no way they would be able to make it to her school anytime soon. She spotted her neighbor Charles and his mother Anne. "Take me with you," Helena pleaded. Anne agreed, cleared it with the principal, and the trio stepped outside. Nothing could have prepared them for what they saw. Who were the terrorists? The horrifying events of September 11th started before Helena was even born. In the late 1980s, a man named Osama bin Laden formed a terrorist group called Al-Qaeda. During the 1990s, Al-Qaeda operated mainly in the countries of Sudan, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. Bin Laden and Al-Qaeda followed an extreme form of Islam that the vast majority of Muslims do not agree with. Al-Qaeda adopted a hateful and murderous ideology of using terrorism to punish Western countries for their perceived crimes against Islam. They vowed to wreak terror on the U.S. in particular. In Afghanistan, Al-Qaeda was protected by the Taliban, an extreme religious group that controlled most of the country. Bin Laden was a longtime enemy of the U.S. Al-Qaeda had bombed 2 U.S. embassies in Tanzania and Kenya in 1998, and the Navy ship USS Cole in 2000. Investigations would later reveal that 19 Al-Qaeda operatives carried out the attacks of September 11th, which they had been planning for years. That morning, they hijacked 4 airplanes and turned them into weapons. They flew the first 2 planes into the Twin Towers near Helena's school. An hour later, they crashed the 3rd plane into the Pentagon, the headquarters of the U.S. military near Washington, D.C. The fourth plane may have been intended for the White House, but in an act of tremendous courage, the passengers managed to overpower the hijackers and gave their lives bringing down the plane in a field in Pennsylvania. Confusion and chaos. In the confusion and chaos of that Tuesday morning, few understood what was happening. In New York, firefighters, police officers, and other first responders converged on Lower Manhattan, risking their lives to rescue as many people as they could from the burning buildings. New York City Mayor Rudolph Giuliani addressed the public on radio and TV. President George W. Bush, who was reading to a class of second graders when he got news of the attacks, was rushed to the White House, where he convened with military leaders. Meanwhile, Helena, Ann, and Charles were trying desperately to get home. Out on the street, Helena felt like she'd been plunged into a horrifying disaster movie. Paper and ash rained from the sky. Injured men and women were being loaded into ambulances. The sounds of shouting filled the air. Some people stood transfixed, staring up in disbelief at the plumes of fire and smoke gushing from two gaping holes in the sides of the towers. Ghosts. The Twin Towers were as iconic as the Eiffel Tower in Paris or the Hollywood sign in Los Angeles. And they were the crown jewels of the World Trade Center, an enormous complex that included a plaza, an underground shopping mall, and 7 buildings. Some 50,000 people worked there. To many, the towers symbolized America's economic power. But to Helena, the World Trade Center was simply part of the landscape of home. The place where she and her mom got donuts, where she shopped for books, where she could go on hayrides in the fall or catch music shows. Now, as Anne led Charles and Helena through the ash-filled streets, that landscape was unrecognizable. Smoke stung Helena's eyes and nose. Anne told her to cover her face with her shirt. Surges of people pushed past, their clothes and faces thick with ash. Helena thought they looked like ghosts. When she caught her own reflection in a window, she was shocked to see that she, too, looked like a ghost. The Twin Towers were designed to withstand powerful forces, but the fires burned so hot that they melted the building's steel frames. 73 minutes after the first plane struck, the South Tower collapsed. 29 minutes after that, the North Tower fell. From Los Angeles to London, from Tokyo to Cairo, people sat glued to their televisions, staring in shock and disbelief as 2 of the most recognizable buildings in the world disintegrated. When the smoke finally cleared, there was only sky. The coming weeks. It took nearly an hour for Helena to get home, a trip that usually took less than 15 minutes. She spent the rest of the day with her grandparents, who lived a few floors above her. She was reunited with her mother that afternoon and her father the next morning. Similar stories unfolded throughout the city as friends and family rushed to find one another. But not every story had a fortunate ending. In the coming days, there was an outpouring of grief for the nearly 3,000 people who lost their lives in the attacks. Newspapers and magazines told stories of heroism, of firefighters who charged into the burning buildings to save others, and of office workers who carried their injured colleagues down smoke-filled stairwells. The wreckage of the building stood 17 stories high and would smolder for months, blanketing Lower Manhattan in a toxic haze. New Yorkers tried to get back to normal, but for many living near the World Trade Center, including Helena, this was impossible. Many were without power for days after the attacks. Some stayed in shelters. The residents in Helena's building stayed put. Her father took on the job of checking on elderly neighbors, delivering food, water, and medications, and acting as a liaison with local authorities. The war begins. As the country was reeling, President Bush mobilized the U.S. military. An international hunt for Osama bin Laden began. It would take nearly 10 years to find him. He was killed in 2011 when U.S. forces raided the compound in Pakistan where he was hiding. There was an outpouring of support and sympathy for the U.S. from many countries, and leaders around the world rallied behind America. On October 7, 2001, U.S. forces began bombing and raiding Afghanistan, where al-Qaeda was believed to be hiding. The Taliban were quickly ousted from power. This was the beginning of a bloody conflict that continues to this day. The events of September 11, 2001 profoundly shaped the world we now live in. In the U.S., new laws and procedures were put in place to protect against future attacks. Airport security was overhauled. President Bush created a new agency called the Department of Homeland Security. Perhaps most important, the attacks shook our sense of safety and changed the way we go about our lives. On trains, announcements about unattended packages make us shift uncomfortably in our seats. We practice emergency drills at school and work. And sadly, the word terrorism is now part of our everyday vocabulary. Rebuilding hope. Experiencing a devastating event will affect different people in different ways. For Helena and for many others, dealing with the horrors of what they witnessed on September 11th has been a long and painful process. 3 weeks after the attacks, Helena and her classmates returned to school in a temporary location uptown. They remained there until the spring, when their school could be reopened. Helena and her family continued to live near what became known as Ground Zero. Like so many, she has struggled with sadness, depression, anxiety, and nightmares. It would take 8 years for Helena to be properly diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, a psychiatric disorder that can occur after experiencing or witnessing a life-threatening event. But after hard work and treatment, Helena is doing well. She is now 27 and a successful journalist. She started her own news agency called Headlines for the Hopeful, in which she features articles about people who are changing the world in positive ways. She also tracked down her former classmates and interviewed them about their memories of September 11th. Her memoir, After 9/11, will arrive in bookstores this month. The city of New York has been on its own road to recovery. Lower Manhattan again teems with life. The smell of sizzling kebabs wafts from the food trucks that line the streets at lunchtime. Tourists snap pictures with selfie sticks. Cyclists weave through traffic. A new skyscraper called the Freedom Tower now rises mere steps from where the Twin Towers once stood. Every day, 4,000 men and women go to work there. Each year, on the anniversary of September 11th, 2 streams of light are beamed from the World Trade Center. They can be seen for miles around. The lights ascend into the sky until they disappear into the night. They stand as powerful reminders of what New York lost that day 15 years ago. But they also symbolize a powerful truth, that New York is a city of tolerance, beauty, and grit that no act of evil can destroy.